Shri Gurubhyo Namaha. Let me begin with the prayer. Sada Shiva Samarambham Shankaracharya Madhyamam Asmadacharya Paryantam Vande Guru Paramparam. Hello everyone, and a very warm welcome to yet another session of Conversations on Consciousness. And today we have a very special guest, Kathirasan K, who is joining us from Singapore. Very warm welcome to you, Kathirasan ji, and thank you for coming on our show. Just a brief introduction to Kathirasan ji. He lives in Singapore and he has studied Vedanta for many years under the tutelage of Swami Satprakashananda Sarasvati of Atma Vidya Vanam, and he has authored several books on Vedanta and secular mindfulness. Professionally, he teaches mindfulness courses, and apart from his profession, he continuously teaches Vedanta to many students across the Southeast Asia. And he is teaching Vedanta. He is in the pursuit of Vedantic ideal for many years now. Again, a very warm welcome to Kathirasan ji. And yes, today we will be discussing about his book, the Advaita Vedanta and Shiva Samhita. This book, I don't know whether you can see this or not. It is a wonderful book. It's a commentary, though written in English. It's a commentary. It is a traditional style of commentary that the Kathirasan ji has written on the first chapter of Shiva Samhita. So, with this very brief introduction, let me straight away jump in, Kathirasan ji, to the questions. Before not discussing about the book and the contents of Shiva Samhita, I want to ask 2 or 3 questions about your personal journey. So, so that the audience get a better understanding of where you're coming from and what has been your life arc, so to speak. So, how did your interest in Vedanta develop, and when did this happen, and how did you meet your guru, Swami Satprakashananda Saraswati ji, and just tell us about whole your life journey, especially the journey, spiritual journey. Yeah.
Thank you, Nithin ji, for having me here and for the warm welcome. Now let me share with you a little about my journey. So some of you may not know, I think many of you may not know that I was born in Singapore, and my parents were also born in this region. And my grandparents came from India. So, and from there, I lived I would say a very simple life in Singapore. I think some of you may know that Singapore is very multicultural. So it is, so people of different cultures live together. People of different ethnic and religious identities also live in Singapore together. So we meet each other face to face every day. That's the kind of environment. And my encounter with Vedanta came from actually a very sincere seeking for answers. So in my teenage years, I mean, when I finished my engineering school, after that in Singapore, we have to serve national service, which means that we are all conscripted to the Army, the Air Force, or the Navy, and we have to serve 2.5 years in the military. So during that time, I started to, a very interesting experience happened to me, which is that I found that the living, because prior to that I was in school, right? So I realized that the way that I lived my life did not give me the satisfaction, which is very interesting, right? This is, of course, a dukkha lakshanam, but at that time I didn't know the word. But I was feeling that everything that I did, it wasn't satisfactory. And there was this thing that, like the drone, that you have in the tampura behind a song, it goes on. I am not happy. I'm not satisfied. Everything I did seems to be very, very laborious, like, so I got entry into a university. I decided to not go. I canceled my application after I got enrolled, because I realized that it was worthless, because I felt that all of this is always trying to do something to become someone else. And this someone else it was very much revolving around how others perceived me. That means I was judging myself, evaluating myself by how the society looked at me, how the society is going to measure me. And all of that created a certain degree of dispassion. I will not say, obviously, it's not a full measure. If it was a full measure, I would have been a sannyasi by now. But there was this, feeling inside of dissatisfaction, not being happy with whatever that is in my life. And thankfully, I encountered some books that actually gave me some great answers. And I want to point out two important works that changed my life. And this was in 1994. All right, when I was 21 years old. So the first book that really radically changed my life was The Life of Sri Ramakrishna. The Life of Sri Ramakrishna, I remember the very old edition, not very old, I guess probably 80s edition, with a very light brown cover with Ramakrishna ji, from Ramakrishna ji in the picture, the front cover. And when I read that, that really inspired me. And right after that, what happened was I went to the Ramakrishna mission in Singapore. There is a Ramakrishna mission in Singapore. And I walked into the mission and said, you know what, I want to learn this. And I went to a Swamiji there. I remember Swami Bhakti Kamananda at the time when I met him. And he told me that, you know what, the first thing that you need to do is just study this, with a sincere effort. And I asked him to recommend some books. And immediately he shared with me the works of Swami Vivekananda. And then the second big impact that led me to Vedanta was actually the complete works of Swami Vivekananda. I remember reading the 8 volumes of his works in just 1.5 years. I finished it, every day looking at the works. And that really inspired me. And I realized that the only way out of this grief, out of this dissatisfaction, was to know myself. All right. So that's when it started. So I was reading the books, and then I realized that you need a teacher. But and then the need for the teacher led me to want to look for a teacher. When I started to look for a teacher, I usually ended up with teachers that did not impress me. They didn't impress me when I started to look for them. So when I stopped searching for them, and then I started to meet great teachers actually. And when I stopped looking for them. And at that time, I was also volunteering at a local Hindu organization. I was a volunteer there. And as I was volunteering there, one interesting thing that happened was I got to organize and also be part of events where they brought very esteemed Swamijis from India. And I got to meet Swamijis from Chinmaya Mission, from the Chinmaya Mission tradition. And also here is where I met Puja Swami Dayananda Sarasvati. And because he used to come to Singapore in the 90s every year. And from 1996 to about the year 2000, I remember attending almost all of his lectures. In fact, I was also behind the team that recorded his lectures on tapes and then duplicating the tapes and then eventually making it MP3s and distributing to a lot of devotees in Singapore. So learning, doing seva, all of that led me to meet, also had some private audience with Swamiji, Puja Swami Dayananda Saraswati ji. And then I asked him, Swamiji, I want to learn. Because his teaching was very interesting because he emphasized the traditional teacher, the need for a traditional teacher to learn Vedanta as opposed to it being just another teacher. So since he was someone who was creating those traditional teachers, I asked him, Swamiji, is there someone I can learn from? Since you're an Indian, I'm in Singapore. And that's when he introduced me my guru. Because he was there on the day that I asked him on the trip, Swami Satprakashananda Saraswati ji was with him. Okay. And then he said, you know what? Yeah. So he said, this is my disciple. He lives in Malaysia, very close to Singapore. Why don't you learn from him? And that's how I encountered my teacher. Then I asked him how I could learn. And then of course, it's a systematic learning. A lot of times, my learning from Swami Satprakashananda Saraswati ji, apart from the Shastra study, was the conversations. I think the conversations where I asked questions and when he answered, that's when the greatest shift took place for me. And then when I looked at the Shastra, it confirmed what he was telling me. The Shastra confirmed what was happening in the Samvada. So my Samvada with him is quite intense one. I wouldn't even let him even have a meal peacefully. Even while having a meal, I'll ask questions. Even while going for a walk, I'll ask questions. Even when he's away, I'll call him and ask questions. And that's when my journey began. Yeah.
Wonderful. That is a very fascinating account. You should consider writing a book on that Samvada as well. That I think that would be wonderful, very interesting people. So, moving forward, let me start with the book, the Advaita Vedanta of Shiva Samhita. I think this is a less charted territory. Before I came across your book, I did not know that there is a Vedanta in the Shiva Samhita text. I was just vaguely aware of Shiva Samhita as one of the three important texts of Hatha Yoga. So, what made you take up this project? I mean, tell us about more about Shiva Samhita and how did you decide to take up this project and how did this happen?
Okay. So my formal learning with Swamiji came to a close at about 2004. 2004, 2005, it came to my formal learning of sitting with him and learning and all of that. And after that, of course, I was continuing my professional life because all my life I've been in the corporate world. And even right now, I'm still in the same industry. But after that, in the 2007, 2008, one thing that I wanted to learn was the Hatha Yoga tradition. I wanted to be a yoga instructor, not for wanting to teach it, but wanting to understand it. Because I could not see, because when I learned Advaita Vedanta with Swamiji, I could not find that much references to Hatha Yoga. But yet, Hatha Yoga is a very big phenomenon globally, and everyone somehow, a lot of Hatha Yoga teachers tend to connect Advaita Vedanta to the teachings. So when I started doing Seva, when I was involved in the voluntary work and I'm meeting people, I could not connect it. So my desire was wanting to connect it. So I'd signed up for a yoga instructor course to first experience it. What is it like? So in the class, as you have said, Nithinji, that the teacher told me that, there are three important Hatha Yoga texts. It's a Hatha Yoga Pradipika, and then the Kathirasan Samhita and the Shiva Samhita. These three will always come out. So what I did was, while I was being trained as an instructor, I procured these books. Of course, I got all of them were critically edited versions that I got from Kaivalya Dhamma. They do very great work in these critical editions. So I got these three texts and I started to do a research and trying to look at what is being taught. And of course, the first thing that I realized was many of the things that are being taught in my yoga instructor course were not in these three books. That was, what a joke, right? So I realized that many of the modern yoga instructor classes and the courses, they don't teach what's in this Shastra actually. So that's the first realization. The second realization is the discovery of Shiva Samhita. When I looked at the first chapter, my eyes, I was just browsing through the pages, and my eyes fell on a very important term, Adhyaropa Apavada. When I saw that, my eyes opened. And I was thinking, why is this Hatha Yoga text talking about Adhyaropa Apavada? And so I was very curious. And then I started to look at it a little more closely. When I started to look at it a little more closely, and I realized that the first chapter was actually entirely on Advaita Vedanta. And it was consistent with the Upanishad tradition. So what happened was, why I wanted to do this. Now, before I even started to do this, because at that time I was also involved in the training of teachers of Sanatana Dharma in Singapore. So I was part of a couple of batches where they go through 2.5 years training to become teachers of Sanatana Dharma. So I was one of the teachers there. And some of them were also very sincere seekers of self-knowledge, Atma Jnana. So I decided that after discovering the Shiva Samhita's first chapter, I realized the first chapter was probably a very, very great text to actually teach someone who is interested, because it's so complete, especially that it talks about some Pravritti Dharma duties, what I call rituals and then it of course does the Apavada, but yet it presents all of that. So when I started to teach this, of course, Anuji was one of the persons in the class as well. And she told me that, this should be actually a very, very great text. And she felt that this could be actually published as a book. And I said, yeah, I think it's a great idea to actually publish this as a book, because not many people know the Shiva Samhita. So what happens is this, right? As what you have said, the Hatha Yoga teachers or Hatha Yoga scholars consider Shiva Samhita as a Hatha Yoga text. The Advaita Vedanta teachers do not look at the Shiva Samhita because it's a Hatha Yoga text. So there's two energies, coming from two different schools of thought, considering misunderstanding the text. So because people who are Hatha Yoga teachers, they completely neglect the first chapter and look at the third, fourth, fifth second, third, fourth, fifth chapters, and they say that it's a Hatha Yoga text. Advaita Vedanta just don't even go there because it's a Hatha Yoga text. So I thought that maybe it's a good opportunity for us to bring this out to the world, because it has its own uniqueness, its own flavor, unlike the other Prakarana Granthas in that sense.
So you chose to write on only the first chapter. So don't you think if you were to write on the remaining chapters, it would be complete in the sense that the whole Shastra would be covered in a commentary. Now only the first chapter is covered. Since you are already trained in Hatha Yoga, then I think you would be better positioned to do this work.
Yeah, on hindsight, to be very honest, I should be doing that actually. Because the fact that to be very honest, the Shiva Samhita has also other contents, not just Hatha Yoga. It also has a lot of Tantra elements as well. There's a lot of tantric elements, especially in the tradition of Kundalini Yoga. All the chakras, all of them are very, very elaborately presented in the Shiva Samhita. So you see three important traditions coming together in the Shiva Samhita. The Advaita Vedanta, which appears in chapter 1 completely, and then a few verses in chapter 2 and a few verses in chapter 5. So therefore, I decided not to comment on it because I think it's not as many to cover. But actually, you're right, because it deserves a full commentary, and maybe one day I will get around doing that, to write a full commentary on the whole Shastra from a Tantra perspective and also a Hatha Yoga perspective as well, to present the works. Although I must say that my conviction is only with Advaita Vedanta.
Yeah, that would be wonderful enough. Keeping the Vedanta as the substratum and then positioning the other teachings within the framework of Vedanta. So that would be great. I think I hope that you do it in the coming years. So moving forward, for the benefit of those who are not familiar with Shiva Samhita, I wanted to introduce a text more brief. You already discussed about the text, but the name itself, I want to ask you, the Shiva and Shiva Samhita, does it stand for Bhagavan Shiva? Does it stand for Shiva as auspiciousness in a sense of a more abstract sense? Or does it have any other connotations?
So the word Shiva is very abstract because it doesn't, of course, the text starts with certain colophons, manuscripts start with Ishvara Uvacha. So naturally, when a text starts with Ishvara Uvacha, then it usually is taken as a Tantra or a Agama. So the Shiva Samhita, because it starts with Ishvara Uvacha, tends to be appearing like a Tantra that we cannot deny. And of course, the fact that it is a Samhita, which is also another term that is used for Tantra. So we can take the position that the Shiva Samhita is actually a Tantra, and as presented as the knowledge presented as in a way that it is coming from the mouth of Lord Shiva. So in that sense, yeah, definitely we can say the Shiva here means Bhagavan, but not in a way that, of course, nowhere in the text is there an explanation or presentation of Bhagavan, or even Maheshwara is not there. Of course, there and here there is some mention, especially when it comes to Panchikarana. It presents Shiva, but otherwise there is no elaborate presentation. It just presents the whole knowledge as coming from the mouth of Lord Shiva.
Wonderful, interesting. So you mentioned Panchikarana. So Panchikarana is a very Vedantic version of creation. So does Shiva Samhita specifically mention creation through the process of Panchikarana and not through other processes that are prevalent?
Yes, it does. It specifically mentions Panchikarana and avoids Trivirkarana, which is also another model that we find in the Upanishad, but it specifically presents Panchikarana as the way the world gets manifested.
I have a side question, not connected to what you said, but not connected to the book per se. We have so many different models of creation. We have the Sankhya model, we have the Nyaya Vaisheshika model, and in the Upanishads itself, we have Panchikarana and the other one you mentioned. So these different models in Indian tradition, and we have Puranic models of creation as well. And then we have modern science with its Big Bang and all those new theories. So from a Vedantic perspective, how do we see this? How do we reconcile these different narratives of manifestation or evolution or creation, however you put it.
Okay. So firstly, we have to, from a Vedantic perspective, we say that the other models of creation from a Sankhya perspective, etc., to be erroneous. We have to take that position primarily because the reliance on the Shastra, which especially the Shruti, Upanishad, doesn't take place as much as you see in the Advaita Vedanta tradition, where the reliance is entirely on the Shruti as a pramana. So we take that to be not as relevant anymore. However, we cannot say that they're completely different as well, because all of them share a common tradition, which is the Dharmic tradition, Vedic tradition. They share is only how much they are aligned and adhere to the teachings of the Upanishads. I think that's the question to ask. So that's number one. So we say that the Upanishad tradition, as presented through the teachers of Advaita Vedanta, perhaps has presented this in a very in a very cogent manner, in a way that we can appreciate it. That's number one. Now, number two, now other models of creation that we see from a scientific perspective, now all of those models entirely depend on pratyaksha and anubhava pramanas. All right, it's perception and inference, and of course they can look at it from a very multiple steps of inferences as well. So they come up with that. So, but if you look at it from a scientific perspective, now we don't see, we cannot say that it is completely in opposition. So the Shastric perspectives can actually resolve the scientific perspective. The Big Bang theory and all of that can be explained from a Shastric perspective. But what the Shastra reveals is far more greater than what the science reveals. So therefore, one includes the other in that sense. So when the Shastra presents creation, the scientific perspectives are included in it. It is not opposing it. But what the Shastra presents in terms of creation is far more bigger than what science presents. But what the Shastra presents is in a very generic form. It doesn't go into the way, atoms get broken up and how they manifest into the world. That's not the purpose of Shastra. We'll talk about that shortly. But science presents that in a more thorough manner, in a more granular manner as to how the world actually, gets manifested. But having said that, Shankara makes it very clearly in his commentary. The purpose of Shastra is not to teach creation. Fantastic. He makes a very important point. The purpose of Shastra is not to teach creation. Creation is a tool. Creation is therefore like a upaya, tool to show the karana karya ananyatva. That means the karana, which is Brahman, Ishvara, whatever that you may call it, is the one who actually becomes the universe. And the creation allows us to show that the universe at all periods of time, in the past, the present, and the future, is never separate from Brahman. So therefore, the purpose of Shastra is not to teach creation. The purpose of Shastra is, or the creation is incidental in that sense, so that it can allow us to see the non-separation, the non-difference between Ishvara and Jagat.
Wonderful. That makes a lot of sense. Reconcile these different positions. So now returning back to Shiva Samhita, in our Shastric tradition, every text is in a sense self-aware. That is, it is aware of its own purposes. So usually in the very beginning itself, it gives its Anubandha Chatushtayam, the four categories, which refers to the content of the text, the phalam or the end result, who are the competent audience, the adhikari, the mutual relationship between them. So does the Shiva Samhita provide Anubandha Chatushtayam as well?
No, it doesn't. It follows the tradition of the Tantra by not providing it. So if you look at even the Bhagavad Gita, it doesn't provide it. It comes at the end. A person who doesn't speak ill of me, a subhakta, etc. Bhakta is the only one who should be taught. So Shiva Samhita belongs to that category of Shastra, where it is not like a Prakarana Grantha where an author presents it systematically. It doesn't do that. But in 2 verses, it does mention it indicates the qualification though. It says, number one, someone who has surrendered to God. That Sharanagati is one particular qualification. And then the other one it says is, he must be a subhakta, not just a bhakta, a subhakta, an ideal devotee, a good devotee in that sense. And of course, it says that it must also be a great person, a Mahatma, it says. So this actually tells us that the adhikari of the Shiva Samhita is someone who is a person who has engaged himself in duties, in karma, and have conducted all the duties in a satisfactory manner. If not, the word Mahatma doesn't appear. There's no license for that usage. So that is the only, I think, indication in terms of adhikara. The rest of the Anubandha Chaturshaya does not appear explicitly, although it's implicit.
Implicitly, I think the very opening verses, they speak about Yoga Darshana, Atma Vidya. So I think they're indirectly speaking about it.
Yes.
I see you have actually compiled and created a chapter on Anubandha Chaturshaya in the book. So you have picked it from these indications, I believe, right?
Yes, you're right. So the Anubandha Chaturshaya is left to the person who is commenting on it. So because I'm commenting on it, I brought it together to show, because it's implicit, I kind of made it explicit in the commentary.
I think a lot of people don't realize the importance of commentary tradition. I mean, merely translation or a translation with certain notes has too much limitations. It is the commentary, through a commentary, that we can add to the tradition, we can expand on the tradition. Whatever is there, we can interpret it to our context and needs. So what are your comments on this?
Yeah, definitely. I think the commentary is, I mean, commentaries are important. Too many commentaries are not very important. I think they can become very, very, a big distraction. So if you realize, sometimes commentaries can be very sufficient in its own way. And there is, I think there is only a need for another commentary on a text when the time, place, and circumstances change. I think that's when the commentaries become valid. I think every commentary somehow becomes invalidated by time, place, and circumstances, with the exception of a few. I think one of those very rare commentaries are the commentaries by Adi Shankara. And these commentaries are very perennial, and almost 99% of what he says, because it relates to Tattva, it is very perennial in that sense. And to be very honest, we don't need much commentaries to understand Shankara's commentaries, right? Because many commentaries would also mean that Shankara's commentaries are insufficient, inadequate. That's the implication. It's a very, I think it's, when looking at Shankara Bhashyam, they're very pretty much complete, actually. So yes, you're right. Commentaries are very necessary, especially for texts that have not been commented on. And I think also commenting on texts that have not been commented on from a very traditional perspective, I think it's very critical to making the subject come alive. And I also believe that commentaries are not, commentary need not be always written. It can also be taught. Commentary by a teacher, as a teacher unfolds the Shastra. Now that is more critical than a written commentary, because the commentary by a teacher as he or she is teaching is more relevant to the Desha Kala Nimitta, time, place, and circumstances, than a text and a commentary on paper. Because a commentary on paper, somehow, you know, after some time, it may become not as relevant, because the examples may not be as relevant. Like today's commentaries will definitely have social media, technological usage as illustrations, as metaphors. But in about 200 years, those technologies will become outdated in that sense. So I think, yes, you're right. I think first, commentaries on texts that have not been commented on is very important. I think a teacher commenting it to a group of seekers, sadhakas, is perhaps more important than perhaps a commentary on book. Although I think certain subjects definitely are perennial, I must say, like Shankara's commentaries. I'm glad that he wrote them, right? If not, we wouldn't have the benefit of having access to the works.
I completely agree. I think what you say makes a lot of sense. I remember when I started writing my English comment on Isha Upanishad 2012, I thought it has come very well. But as it dragged on, and when I revisited 2 or 3 years back to finish the manuscript, a lot of things I say I could have written so much better. It's all outdated. If this is the case for 5 years gap, so just imagine 5 centuries and 10 centuries.
I had the same challenge as well, because I recently completed a commentary on the Sadhana Panchakam. So I wrote a commentary, very elaborate one. And then I wrote that, not that I recently, I wrote that, I think I taught that many years ago, and then was transcribed. And then I was looking at the script, and exactly as what you said, I looked at it after a few years and I realized there is one thing of more clarity. So I realized this will never end, you know, because every time we are looking at any verses or any text, the current Kathirasan is different from the Kathirasan of the past, you know. So there's always something more to contribute. Anyway, that itself is something like samsara, right? It never ends.
Yeah. So moving forward, you mentioned how this Shiva Samhita comes from a Tantra tradition from a Hatha Yoga tradition, and in a somewhat a Vedantic tradition as well. So, if we are to take a step back and see the text of Shiva Samhita as a whole and not divide it into chapters, should we consider it as a text which places Hatha Yoga within the larger frame of Vedanta, or as positing Vedanta being the underlying philosophy of Hatha Yoga itself, or as an attempt at reconciliation of two or more different traditions by an unknown author? So
Yeah.
what is the best way to perceive the text as?
Yeah, I would take this. I would take the third view that you mentioned. It's actually quite an unsuccessful attempt at reconciliation, for the mere fact that now, why am I saying is unsuccessful? So, for us to make it successful, is dependent on the commentator. How do we reconcile this? I'll share with you. Number first thing is, why is it unsuccessful? Because the text doesn't do the reconciliation, right? The text doesn't present the reconciliation at all. It just presents the three subjects in a manner that they are quite disjointed. Actually, that's what you see. So therefore, I think that has it always been the commentator tradition is to do the reconciliation, like the Samanvaya that we see in the Brahma Sutra, right? So the reconciliation happens in the hands and the eyes of the teacher, right, who's looking at the text. But if you ask me, is it reconcilable? My answer is yes, it can. Because in the Vedanta tradition, we do not discount and neglect karma. This is a very important point, right? In the Advaita Vedanta tradition, we say that karma has a utility, right, for a purpose of chitta shuddhi, mental purification. For one to become an adhikari, karma can be of great value. But what we deny is the karma's effectiveness in conferring moksha. That's when the karma is not valuable at all. So while karma may not be the direct means for moksha, but karma, when performed with the karma yoga buddhi of the arpana buddhi and prasada buddhi, therefore through that a person can become eligible or competent to pursue jnana, which is the primary means to attain moksha. So when you look at it from that perspective, we can reconcile by placing all the other sadhanas, or the tantra sadhanas, the hatha yoga sadhanas, in the domain of karma. So when we put hatha yoga sadhanas, which is of course very much kayika sadhana, or even if it is a vachika sadhana, sometimes there are sadhanas that involve the chanting of the matrikas and also the shabdas, the syllables, all right, all the aksharas that are connected to the chakras. So vachika sadhana, and also manasa sadhanas, which is sometimes can be meditation, right, on particular deities. Now all of them can be now placed in the domain of karma or upasana. So when those practices in the Shiva Samhita, when we place them as karmas or upasana, therefore can become a means to purify oneself. And the other interesting thing is that I always like mentioning this, is that the Advaita Vedanta content appears in the first chapter, not the last one. So what does this tell us? So I always make this as a joke. So if you've studied the first chapter and you've understood it, you would not go to the second chapter. Right? So you've understood it. It's like the Ishavasya idam sarvam, right? In Ishavasya Upanishad. If you know that very clearly, the second verse becomes futile, actually, to be honest, right? That promotes a pravritti, right? So the whole idea is that if I understood the first chapter, if I know myself very clearly, there's no need for me to go into the second and third and fourth and fifth chapters. So if someone doesn't end that whole samsara by studying the first chapter, then what happens is the second, third, fourth, fifth chapter become a means to purify oneself. And this methodology is also found in the Aparoksha Anubhuti, in the text that says in the last verse, those of you who have not taken care of your desires, go and practice Hatha Yoga. It's like a pun, it's like a pun intended in that author, who says, hey, if we have not taken care of your desires and your what I call your need for enjoyment, artha and kama, then go and perform Hatha Yoga. So if you use that as that verse as a methodology or pedagogy, then we can use that pedagogy to reconcile the teaching of the Shiva Samhita.
That makes a lot of sense. or another interpretation while I was reading the book and I was reading this comment came to my mind. We can see that Vedanta as a laying out a philosophical basis for the Hatha yogis, just showing the ultimate goal, where they have to ultimately go through this path. And so when I started reading the book, the very first verse of Shiva Samhita caught my attention. You know, the first portion of the verse repeats the well-known Upanishadic position that there is only one reality, one eternal consciousness that exists without a beginning, without an end, and all those things. And however, in the second portion of the verse, the last pada of the verse, as if anticipating the question, if reality is one, how come we perceive diversity in the universe? I think this is a very common question everybody has, the very basic question. So, basically the second part of the verse of Shiva Samhita implies that diversity is merely an appearance caused due to sense perceptions. Can you elaborate on what exactly it means when it says diversity is caused by the senses? Is it hinting at the Drishti Srishti Vada or the Ajati Vada, the Prakriyas of Vedanta?
So, in my opinion, there are a couple of ways we can look at it. Of course, I must say that we cannot discount the possibility of a Drishti Srishti Vada. We cannot discount it, but of course, it doesn't use the term, it doesn't explicitly present it, but we can see that it is alluding to it. Now, but towards the later part of the chapter, it switches more to a Srishti Drishti Vada. There is a reason for this. So let's talk about, this is my own interpretation. I think other teachers and other sadhakas and scholars panditas can also interpret it differently. But my perspective is, it is very, very astute in presenting the fact that the world of diversity that we see, it is actually caused by the Indriya Upadhi. Very important word. The diversity is caused by limiting adjuncts, which are centered on the self. Now, there is a very important approach here. Now, instead of trying to see whether it's a Drishti Srishti Vada or a Srishti Drishti Vada, the important question is rather, why are you seeing the multiplicity? Is it because of someone else or is it because of yourself? Now, that locus of multiplicity is very key. So this shloka, when it says that this Bheda that you see, the differentiation, is because of the Upadhi that is in the Indriya, it is actually shifting the responsibility on the self, on the person, instead of trying to blame something else. Like, for example, sometimes in my early years before I met Swamiji, I used to see a lot of books that says, why are you seeing this multiplicity? You know what they will say? Maya. They'll say Maya has a Vikshepa Shakti and Avrana Shakti. Because of that, you see it. In fact, that Shiva Samhita says the same thing a little later. But in the initial approach, it doesn't say that. It says it's centered on the self that I see this multiplicity, the Bheda in the Jagat. So what does this tell us? The responsibility of actually removing this multiplicity that I see in the world is actually on myself. I am responsible for this. I should not use something else outside to say, oh, that's why I'm seeing this diversity. Actually, it's me. And this very much connects to a lot of times that Shankara uses a compound in his Bhashyam. You may be familiar with it. Avidya, Kama, Karma. Avidya, Kama, Karma, Avidya. This connection, these three words, he connects. Or Avidya, Kama, Kriya, he says. So these three words that he uses shows a very important principle in the whole tradition of Advaita Vedanta. The reason that I see or the multiplicity or diversity is because of avidya. And where is this avidya? Is it outside or is it inside? Right? If I say it's outside, then I'm shifting the burden. Right? I'm now looking for something in the outside world to solve my problem. So the locus of control, the locus of choice now is now shifted to the individual, the sadhaka. I need to resolve my avidya. And that seems to be the position that the Shiva Samhita takes in the first verse that he says, Ekam Jnanam Nityam Adyanta Shunyam. Very nice word that is very indicative of what you say in the Upanishad, Taittiriya Upanishad, Satyam Jnanam Anantam Brahma. It is reworded in that sense. So I hope that this makes sense in the sense that it shifts the responsibility to the individual. It is because of me that I'm seeing, therefore the avidya is my responsibility. To resolve this avidya is also my responsibility. But how do I do that? Now, therefore, I need to do something. Now, that is, I think, the burden of the author of this text in that sense.
I found it uncanny resemblance. Many of the portions of the Shiva Samhita, it has it reminds me of the Gaudapadacharya's Karika. At many places, I mean, it, it is not literally same thing, but there is a reflection of a similar kind of approach to the questions of consciousness of this uh, diversity and all those things. What are your
Yeah,
comments?
yeah. I do not disagree at all. In fact, the Shiva Samhita is very consistent with the Karikas, the Mandukya Karikas, especially in the sense that it uses the word mithya quite a bit, which is something that even Gaudapadacharya uses in his Karika as well, the mithya in that sense. And also that asparsha yoga. The asparsha is not, the term is not used in this Shastra, but something very similar, the same meaning is asamlagna, something that is not connected. That term is used. So at all times, the Shastra, Shiva Samhita presents the world that we see and the Atma, which is Jnanam, to be not connected at all. It is not in contact in any way. So you're right. It is completely consistent in that sense, without using those explicit terms in that sense. So in that sense, the author does not want to imitate. I think that's something very important. It's not an imitation of another text, right? It is originally in that sense.
Yes, yeah, that is true. It is original and it has its approach. I absolutely loved it. I went through the verse after verse with your translation and few comments and a quick look, and I absolutely loved its dealing. Another thing that caught my eye was the first chapter, which has around some 100 verses, I think, if I'm not wrong. A third of it, around 33 verses, it dedicates to karma anushtana. You don't find it in most of the Upanishads except for Ishavasya Upanishad, perhaps, wherein he speaks about the Pravritti Marga as well as Nivritti Marga. So I found this elaboration on Karma Anushtana very interesting. Can you shed light on what is the Shiva Samhita's position on karma? What are its salient teaching on karma and relationship between karma and jnana? And where does it place a Hatha Yoga practice in the whole scheme?
So number one, you're right. That observation is certainly valid. You made a very good observation because unlike other texts, the Shiva Samhita presents them one by one. It says mantra yoga, it says the tirtha anusevanam, which is yatra, all of that, satyam, tapaha, all of that is very clearly stated. So you don't find that in a lot of other texts because a lot of other texts, it assumes that the seeker is a sannyasi, right? Right. So therefore, there is no reason for us to elaborate much on karma except for the Bhagavad Gita, which makes it an exception. So likewise, the Shiva Samhita, the karmas are presented very elaborately, which is the Pravritti Dharma Lakshanam, right? It is presented, all of that karmas to be done, and it enumerates them very, very clearly, one by one, in a few verses. It presents that. After presenting that, it makes two important positions that it takes in the chapter and of course in other chapters as well. Now, karma, although you perform karma, you should do it in a way that you renounce the results of karma. Karma phala tyaga, it mentions that. So that's the first point that it makes. So if at all you perform karma, make sure that you perform it with the attitude of a karma yogi, which is basically the renunciation of the fruits of the action, which is basically prasada buddhi, or sometimes it's called karma phala tyaga. So that's the first thing it mentions. The second thing it mentions is it takes the position that the most eligible person is actually a karma sannyasi. That means a person who has a sannyasi, a yati. That's the person who can, or rather, it doesn't say it's the person rather, but rather it says karma sannyasa. That means karma has to be renounced in order for you to know. So then, who then should perform karma? So in a later chapter, it says it is the grahasthas. So it says grahasthas should perform karma with this attitude of karma palatyaga, and therefore you become eligible for this yoga, which is Atma Jnana. That's what it says. Having given that the importance to karma through karma yoga, it demolishes the effectiveness of karma as well. It's a very emphatic in that sense and says that, you know what, there is no way that karma can actually lead you to moksha, which is very much the teaching of the Upanishad. So by doing karma, one cannot know the self. That it is very, very clear. So after presenting all the karmas, it takes the view that the karmas are not effective in trying to lead to moksha.
Oh, one of the debates we are almost towards the end of the session, just a few more questions. So, one of the debates within the Vedanta tradition is whether, in the scheme of this Shravana Chatushtaya, Shravana Manana Nidhyasa, so whether Shravana directly facilitates Atma Jnana or whether one has to necessarily undergo the whole process, Shravana Manana Nidhyasana, fully to attain self knowledge or Atma Vidya. In the verse 32, I think it was verse 32 in the Shiva Samhita, it quotes the Shruti. I think this is you mentioned in the commentary that this is the first place where it actually quotes the
Yep.
Shruti, where it quotes the verse, the Drashtabhya, Atma Vare, Drashtabhya, Shotavya, that verse. It, at least when I read it for the first time, it gave me an impression that the Shiva Samhita is taking the earlier position, that Shravana being the primary means,
Hmm.
that facilitates Atma Jnana. What are your views on this?
Now, I'm going to answer this in two ways to answer this question. The first thing is the Shiva Samhita does not say explicitly that because it has the word Adi. It says, so it's actually Drishtabhya, Shottabhya, Mantabhya, Nidhyasitabhya from the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad. It's actually directly quoting that. And because he did not quote entirely, it uses the word Adi. So it entertains the value of Manam and Nidhyasanam. It does do that. So we can say that it says that process is actually Shravanam, Manana, Nidhyasana. But the question about whether Shravana is important on itself, I think that debate has been, you're right in the sense that debate is going on even between the two sub-traditions of Vedanta, the Bhamati tradition and the Vivarana tradition. But if you look at Shankara Bhashya, Shankara does take the position that Shravana has the ability to deliver what he call confer mukti or moksha directly, right? At the same time, in another verse, he says Shravana, Manana, and Nididhyasana. So the way that we should look at this is very important now, right? So the key point that we need to see is that Manana and Nididhyasana depend on Shravana. So Shravana becomes the Angi, while Manana and Nididhyasana become something that you build on top of what you have heard from the teacher. So that's why it is very important in another text, I think you may be familiar with, which is called the Anubhuti Prakasha by Swami Vidyaranya. He makes a very nice purpose for the Shravana, Manana, Nidhyasana. So for Shravana, it is Jnana Prapti, gaining knowledge. And for Manana, it is Samshaya Nivritti, removing doubts. And for Nidhyasana, it is Viparita Bhavana Nivritti, removing all the opposing tendencies. So if you realize the removal of the doubts and the removal of the opposing tendencies cannot take place without Jnana Prapti, without gaining the knowledge. So therefore, Shravana has the capacity. Now I need to make this I want to make this very consciously, very deliberately. I'm saying that Shravana has the capacity to confer moksha immediately. Then question is now, if that is the case, then why is there Manana and Nidhyasana? So it depends on the Adhikari. It depends on the Adhikara of the Adhikari. Some of us are Uttama Adhikaris. If some of us, if we are Uttama Adhikaris, Shravana is enough. We don't need Manana and Nidhyasana. The moment that someone says Tattvamasi, maybe you'll see it, right? There are a lot of such people in our contemporary world as well, right? In the recent past, many teachers like that. All they need is one word or one statement and they know themselves. So these are the Uttama Adhikaris. Shravana has the capacity to deliver moksha. And then there are other kinds of adhikaris, the Madhyama adhikaris and the Adhama adhikaris, right? The middling people with middling competence and people not as competent. For such people, Manana and Nididhyasana are very important because after the Shravanam, we need to be guided through the process of removing doubts and also be established in it. That's number one. Now that's number two, the point number two. Now there's also one other thing that we need to recognize, that this Shravana, Manana, Nididhyasana as a method for knowing the self is not emphasized very much by Shankara. Now, it's a very important point because today we tend to say, what is the way to know oneself? We always quote Shravana, Manana, Nididhyasana. But the argument is, if Shravana, Manana, Nididhyasana were to be the only method to know the self, shouldn't it appear in all Upanishads? Why is it appearing only in the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad? So that tells us that the Shravana Manana Nididhyasana is not the only method, but we must say it is one of the most structured methods. And Shankara recognizes that. He does say that Shravana Manana Nididhyasana many times, he quotes it. But the primary thing that is delivering someone from samsara to moksha or mukti is actually the jnana. It's a knowledge which is presented in the Shravana. So that is something that we need to see. But of course, Shravana, Manana, Nididhyasana is a very important process, but it comes only in one Upanishad. So if you take that argument, traditionally, every sadhaka would only study the Upanishad in their Shaka. So if they're not in the Yajurveda Shaka, right, and they will never come to know the Shravana, Manana, Nididhyasana, does that mean that they cannot attain moksha? It cannot be the case. So what we are saying is the Jnanam is the one that is to be gained. And the Shravana, Manana, Nididhyasana is one of the most structured methods in that sense. So therefore, it is Shravanam that is primary. Manana, Nididhyasana are secondary. All right? Although they are very, very effective and very helpful to a sadhaka.
I think this is the view of Vivarna school as well.
Yes, you're right.
If I'm right?
Yes.
So yeah, in the beginning of this discussion, you mentioned that when you first took a look of Shiva Samhita, what caught your attention was Adhyaropa Apavada, which is a very well-known Vedantic Prakriya. Do you, after your detailed study, have you found other Vedantic Prakriya also in the text, like Karya Karanavada and other Prakriyas?
So if you look at the Shiva Samhita, only the Adhyaropa Apavada Prakriya is mentioned explicitly. Now, there could be a reason to this, all right? Let me just share why it could be so. Because Shankara explicitly mentions the Adhyaropa Apavada as a Prakriya method, right? In the Gita Bhashyam, he mentions that as like a jargon, all right? But of course, Shankara is not interested to create jargons. We see that all the time in his works. Subsequent teachers of the tradition have created all these jargons, right? As a Prakriya, etc. So every other Prakriya, for example, the Karanakarya Prakriya, the Panchakosha Prakriya, the Shariratraya Prakriya, or even the Avastatraya Prakriya, or Anvaya Vetireka Prakriya, all of them appear to be what I call subsumed under the Adhyaropa Apavada Prakriya. Because Karanakarya, Panchakosha, all of the other Prakriyas use the same method of the Adhyaropa Apavada. So that is one way of looking at it. Of course, there are some other acharyas who say that they are all independent Prakriyas. All right, that's one. Now, coming to your question, direct question about whether these Prakriyas appear in the Shiva Samhita. So only the Adhyaropa Apavada Prakriya appears for the reason that I believe that it assumes all the other Prakriyas into it. That's one. But if you want to look for the evidence for the other Prakriyas in the Shiva Samhita, we certainly see implicit reference to Karanakarya Prakriya, etc. And also Anvaya Vetireka Prakriya are there implicitly in the Shastra. But it doesn't present the Shariratraya, it doesn't present the Panchakosha in that sense. Or even the Avastatraya is not explicitly mentioned.
Wonderful, Kathirasan K. I think we can keep discussing this for another hour or two, and I would have loved to do that. But we are almost out of time, and we have come to the ending of the conclusion of this session. So one last question I will request you to take up is, you have been a teacher of Vedanta for a long time, and I love listening to you. Whenever we have met, we have had this beautiful conversation. So what would be your advice to any new student, new seeker of Vedanta? How should he or she start the journey? What are the, I know you already suggested 2 books in the beginning itself, but apart from those books, Shastric study, before going to a teacher, if one were to start somewhere, so do you recommend some texts that they should take up first before going further?
So firstly, I don't consider myself a teacher technically. I just share what I know. There's so much, to be known in that sense. So I'm answering from the perspective of someone who's also taking the same journey. So my answer to that question comes from the introduction to the Bhagavad Gita that Adi Shankara gives in his Gita Bhashyam. Very, very beautiful introduction that I love reading, because that introduction, the Gita Bhashya introduction, completely changed my life, to be very honest. Why? Because it answers this question that you're asking. So the most important step for a sadhaka is to know whether you are wanting moksha genuinely. Whether the desire for moksha, the mumukshutvam, is genuine. Now, what do I mean by genuine? sometimes we seek moksha because of some relative problems in our life. You know, we have a problem with our job, we have a problem with our spouse, we have a problem with our children, we have a problem with our boss, we have a problem with the country that we are in. So because that problem that is coming into my life, trying to find a relief from it, and I think moksha is the solution to it. The answer is obviously not. So a genuine seeker is not someone who is trying to remove a problem or among many problems in our life. The genuine seeker is the one who wants to remove the fundamental problem, which is something that is there throughout your life. So if I'm experiencing dukkha or grief or suffering in any way, sorrow, you know, throughout my life, you know, for a length of time, that could be a good indicator. So what does that mean? So before we even look for a teacher or before we even decide that moksha is my goal, the most important step is self-reflection. To really ask ourselves, is really what I'm seeking is freedom from everything? Or am I trying to solve a small problem? You know, trying to solve, you know, a life problem with Vedanta is like using a sledgehammer to kill a mosquito. Right? So and another way, another Acharya says this very nicely, the solution to a headache is paracetamol, not removing your head. So Vedanta removes your head because it removes the there's no more problem at all, right? If you're looking for happiness, to be very honest, Vedanta is not the answer for you, because happiness can be defined very differently. Some of us only become happy when there are objects around us, when there are certain things that I can experience. So if these are my life experiences and this is what I'm looking for, and I'm looking for Vedanta to give me another anubhava, another experience, certainly I am not an adhikari. So the first important step is to do a proper evaluation of one's desire for moksha, to see whether am I seeking moksha for the right reasons. That's why my teacher, Swami Satprakashananda, Sarasvati ji says very nicely, a mumukshu has to become a jignasu. Very important. What does that mean? A mumukshu is someone who wants moksha, but a jignasu is the one who wants knowledge. So he becomes then a well-informed mumukshu in that sense. So this conversion of mokshatam into jignasa, the pursuit of knowledge, all right, being a jignasu is a very, very important step. Because if that doesn't take place, I may go into the world of Vedanta, and after that, I realize that actually that is not for me. I will drop out at the same pace, at the same speed. I realize, no, this is not what I want. I still want to enjoy. I still want all of this in my life. I still want to be the way I am right now. Now, when that happens, I will find the Vedanta journey itself very torturous, because I made a choice and I'm there, but I'm not understanding it and I don't appreciate it anymore. So that's the only thing that is required, self-reflection. Whether am I genuinely seeking moksha or trying to solve a problem?
Thank you, Kathirasan ji. That was a very practical advice, I would say, and I'm sure a lot of viewers have benefited from it. So with this, yes, we come to a conclusion of yet another session of Conversations on Consciousness. And on behalf of entire Advaita Academy and all of our viewers, I again thank you, Kathirasan ji, for agreeing to do this session and sharing your wonderful insights into Vedanta, into Shiva Samhita. And I I highly recommend this book by you, the Advaita Vedanta of Shiva Samhita, to all our audience. It's a wonderful book. It's a must-read book. If you're serious into Vedanta, this is a book you must read. So with this, I conclude this session. Do follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. Subscribe to our channel and follow us on social media to know about more events we are doing. Shri Guru Pranam.